So in today's lesson, we're going to take a look at rigging an eyeball, particularly for cartoonic kind of animation, but of course going to be applied for actual eyeballs, I guess. So to begin off, I modeled an eyeball very quickly. It has two parts. It has basically the eyeball itself on the inside, and on the outside has this, basically mimicking the lens. And to show you a quick render, if we take a look at this, you can see that the pupil, much like the iris and the eyeball, feels fairly uh, mimicking that reality. And of course, I have that blood vein kind of thing going on in the background without the veins, because that freaks me out. So, but notice that we have a little bit of a highlight. We have that texture of the iris, and then that pupil. And so what we're going to do in our rig is we're going to make sure that we build in the ability for the pupil to get smaller, and then widen to full dilation. So that said, if we take a look at how this eye works, you can kind of start seeing how the lens functions. So the lens is distorting much like a glass. And of course, if we go to a much more extreme, you can see that while the geometry is pushed in, as you see here, that lens is pulling it out a little bit, so mimics that feeling of an actual eyeball. Just a small little feature. Anyway, so what we're going to do is we're going to create some two blend shapes, one with the pupil closed and one with it fully dilated. So what I'm going to do is, right now I have this eye lens selected, and I could do one of two things. I can just select my eyeball and then isolate the selected. Or the other option, of course, is that I can just turn on and off that visibility. So for this case, I'm just going to turn off visibility for now. So now that I have this eyeball selected, I'm going to duplicate it twice. So once, put it off to the side, and two. And so these two are going to become blend shapes that I will apply to the main eye shape. So this one, what we'll do is actually, if we, right now I have subdivision turned on, so if we hit 3 on our keyboard, it will subdivide. And if we hit 1, it will go back to the actual geometry without subdivision. So we'll work in this mode for now. So right now I'm going to do, because we have good edge loop, ring and edge loops for this eye, because this is simple, well, it's a pretty simple shape. I'm going to left click on one face and then double click on the next to it, and then I'm going to then scale up the inside so that this one would be the fully dilated one. So while holding down Control and left clicking on this scale button, I can scale up all that uniformly. And then what I'll do is with this edge loop, I'll do the same thing. Just go to edge and double click on it. I should select that entire ring, hold down Control with the scale option and scale that up. And so what I want to do is make sure that I retain a good spherical organicness shape to that lens, or to that iris. So maybe I'll increase it just a bit more. Maybe I'll just decrease it a little bit. Actually, I'll just undo. I think what we had before was fine. So that's the fully dilated version. So I'm just going to rename this, since our first one was eyeball, I'm going to rename this to pupil open. Now this one will become our closed pupil. Same concept. I'm just going to select that ring. I'm going to hold down Control and then scale it inward. And then likewise, I want to make sure that this is pushed inward too, so the the texture stretches as if the actual iris was existing to do that same thing. So I'm going to push this inward. Probably right about there, and then I'm just going to push it back slightly. Okay. So now when I select both or all three of these, and then we subdivide, you'll see what our two blend shapes will do when subdivided. So, and then, like I did with the first one, I'm just going to rename eyeball 2 to pupil closed. And with that done, I'm just going to now select both of these, and then I'm going to shift select to then apply to our last selection, which is our eyeball, these two shapes as a blend shape. And so now that I have done that, I'm going to hold down the spacebar, and then I'm going to go to Create Deformers, and then I'm going to go to Blend Shape, but I'm going to go to the option box. When the option box appears, the blend shape node appears with an option to put a name in. And because we want to keep pretty organized and tidy, I'm just going to call this Pupil Dilation, and click Apply, and then close this out. And then you will see that a new blend shape node has been created. And so when I middle mouse click and then drag left to right, you'll notice that the geometry changes for the pupil open, and then of course the close. Now the cool thing is that when you're doing blend shapes, you can sometimes correct things that you may not want on the two blend shapes that have been applied, because right now in Maya these two are still connected to this. And so if I make any updates or changes, like for example, I am going to go and dilate the pupil, let's just have it dilate open. What I can do is I can go and make changes to this original geometry, and then the points will update here. So if I do this, pull it out, you can see that geometry has now been updated with the new information that has been applied from this particular blend shape. And then of course, if I was to dilate it, that geometry would change. But of course, I don't want that in my eyeball, because no eyeball does that. If that did happen, it would be probably very painful, and you would probably go blind. But now that that has changed, back, just undoing, I'm going to, because I don't need these anymore for this particular scenario, I can select these and delete them. And just to show you what happens, the dilation now is independent because it's now stored as a separate node with all that translation information for the points, the vector, the vertices. And notice that if we do both of these at the same time, what happens is that the blending will now average. We don't quite want that, so we're going to use a set driven key to actually control how this animates, because I prefer that the middle position would be this shape, and then of course our end position would be this for one end, and then when it's closed I want it to be this shape. I don't want this to influence as the middle shape. So we're going to use set driven keys to control that. And so in order to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, first off, I'm going to go to Window, and then I am going to go to Outliner, because the thing I want to do is turn back visibility on the eye lens. And I'm now going to parent the eyeball to the eye lens. And how I do that is by simply clicking on the eyeball and then holding down our Command key if you're on a Mac. You can then select your iLens and then hit parent, P for parent, and then the eyeball and iLens will now be essentially as if it was one piece. This is good for, this is a process of rigging, so you just want to make sure that everything is grouped properly or parented properly. So in this case, for my rig, I'm going to have the eyeball work with the eye lens. And in fact, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to freeze transformations. Because when I'm working with geometry or groups or controls or anything, you basically want a ideal starting points for when you're rigging, and you don't want this to accidentally influence some of the calculations that Maya will make when you're creating your rig. I'll show you examples later, but for now I'm just going to freeze transformations on my eyeball. So I'm going to make sure that everything is zeroed out because this will be my starting point. So I'll go to Edit, go to Modify, and then Freeze Transformations. And then I'm going to do the same thing with my own lens. In fact, you can now hit G, and it will perform the last action. Okay. So now that's done, I'm going to now create a control. Because that control, what's going to happen is that it is going to be combined with this, oops, did I add? Yeah, I accidentally added something. So what's going to happen is that I'm going to have the control not only control how the pupil dilates, it's also going to be associated as an aim control. So that when we push the control to the left side or the right side or anywhere in our scene, the eye will follow, which is a pretty neat rigging thing. So I'm going to go to create a NURB primitive, and I'm going to choose circle. You choose anything you want, but in my case I usually like to default to simple shapes like circles. I'm going to bring it out here, and then I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees. The other cool thing that you can do with your controls, sometimes it's nice to color them. You can go to your attribute editor, and then underneath the NURB circle shape, you will see a object display node. Now, if you go underneath this, there will be something called drawing overrides. If I enable the override, you have some options. For this particular shape, I'm going to make sure that, well, I'm just going to change the color to something very different, so I'm just going to select like a yellow. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to scale this down, almost kind of to like the pupil shape. If I wanted to get really, really specific, maybe I would scale it down even further, but it really doesn't matter, it's your choice. Just as long as you know that represents the pupil. So now that I have my shape and it's visible in our scene, like I said, I want to freeze the transformations. And then this is why. So for example, if I was to do something like constrain, as is right now, to this eyeball, if I was to select this, hold down Shift, and then left click on my eyeball, and then I go to Constraint, and let's say I'm just going to do scale, notice what happens. So I just quickly backtracked and then undid what we did. And then so I'm going to now basically freeze transformations. So go to modify and then freeze transformations. And everything's been reset. So now from now on everything will be relative to this position. And so what I'm going to do is now I'm going to create a set driven key. But before I do, I'm going to change this control. So I'm going to call this CTRL. CTRL is short for control. I usually put everything in uppercase because I know that when I go into my outliner and I'm just quickly looking, I can tell, you know, what's a control and sometimes usually what's geometry. So actually, while the outliner is still open, I'm going to go to my eyeball. And so what we'll be doing is that we're going to be creating an opportunity for the set-driven to control this. And what a set-driven key will do is that basically it's like imagine creating key positions, but it's tied to a number. And those key positions will be stored in an attributes on our control. So what I'll be doing now is I'm going to create a new attribute. So I'm going to go to the Edit Attribute tab up here, go to Edit, Add Attribute, and then we'll have many options. And for this particular situation, I'm going to create a long, my name is going to be called Pupil. I guess I'll just call it Pupil Dilation. And I want my data type to be float. That's going to allow us to do numbers in between. So for example, if I did integer, it would only be able to do 1, 2, 3, 4. But for a simple slider, I want to have in between points. Boolean, of course, does a on and off function. String is basically you can have text information inserted. Enum, what that allows you to do is almost like a drop-down menu of different names that are pre-done. And then vector is basically three points of data stored. But for our situation, for the I, we're just going to do a float point. Now you're going to have a minimum and a maximum and a default. So since this is going to be my default position, I'm just going to have this be 0. 0 will be my default. And that means that just like freezing transformations, if I was to say select this and reset everything to 0, this will be my default position. And then I'm going to set a minimum to -1. And that -1 will probably be how tight the pupil is. And then our maximum will be how large our pupil is. Okay, so this will represent the maximum of how large the dilation gets and how small the dilation gets. Okay. Once we're done, we click Add. And then you'll notice here, pupil dilation by default is set to 0. And then if I was to increase or decrease that by middle mouse clicking and moving left to right, you'll notice that it only puts in a maximum and minimum value. So if you go beyond, so let's say 5, it will reset it back to 1, knowing that this is the minimum value. It's quite convenient. And of course you can key this too, just like anything else animation-wise. So you can set key points on your timeline for that attribute, which is of course what you want in animation. It's going to break connections. Okay, so we have our min and max, but now it's not doing anything because we haven't set it to do anything. So that is our next thing to do, is now we're going to create a set-driven key. So if we select this pupil dilation, go to Edit and Set Driven Key, we're going to get this window. And this window is going to allow us to have what's called the driver and the driven. The driver is what our control will be, and our driven will be the blend shapes. So anything that we input here is basically going to drive what values we have down in here. So because this is set up slightly different, we're going to make sure that our object is selected, and we're going to hit load driver to make the control the driver. Okay, and then pupil dilation, I'm going to select that. Now going over to here, I'm going to select my eyeball. But if we select our eyeball and say load driven, notice that our blend shape doesn't appear. That's because we have to select our blend shape node. So if we go over to our eyeball that is now selected in the channel box editor, scroll down and select pupil dilation, what will happen is that, actually if we select any of these and then we click load driven, it will now load both the eyeball and the pupil dilation node. So for now I'm going to click on pupil dilation, and then I am going to, this manipulates the open first. Okay. So much like animation, we're going to key the positions. And so like I said, for the pupil open, we want to make sure that our maximum value, which is 1 in this case, is going to represent when the pupil is open. So we have to set that first and make sure that is selected. Now we go over to Pupil Dilation, click on Eyeball Pupil Open, and then make sure that this is set to 1, because this is also our maximum. And you can see that opened up our pupil. Once that is set, we click Key. And when we do that, it'll highlight the attribute in red, saying that there's information stored in that key. Okay. So now that that is done, we're now going to, remember if I said before, we want to make sure that when the pupil is back to normal, normal size, we want to set this to 0, and that our pupil dilation is going to switch back to being normal. And so our blend shape then is going to be, if we click on this, go to Pupil Open, we want this to be set to 0. Okay. So now if I go to my pupil dilation attribute, you can see that that now controls anything beyond 1 in the positive direction up to 1 will increase or decrease back to our normal position, our pupil. Now we're done with that, and so we're going to do the exact same thing with pupil closed. So because now this is set to 0, we want to make sure the pupil closed position is set to 0 as well. So I'm going to click on the node here, go to Pupil Closed. This is set to 0, and then I'm going to go to Key. And now that will also turn red. So that information is now stored as for our pupil dilation. This is now set to 0, and at that position, this is now also going to be set to 0. So now, go back to your eye control, pupil dilation, and then we're going to position it to -1. -1 will be our minimum value. So we're going to go to pupil dilation and make sure our closed is also turned on. And then we're going to get Key. So if you do this correctly, it's all done. We should be all set. You click on the eye control, and then you'll notice that our positioning, of course, I'm going to just turn the visibility. Actually, I'm just going to do this. Just going to only have these two. So I isolated so that the eye lens is no longer seen. So we can see more closely. We can see that with our control, you can see the dilation working. And this all was just simple slider. Pretty awesome, right? Okay, so our rigging is not quite done yet. So now what I'm going to do is that, turn this back on. Now I'm going to set up the aim control. And I want to make sure that our aim control, basically anytime we move this anywhere in our scene, the eye will follow. So the first thing I'm going to do, typically what I personally like doing, is I like to group anything that is going to have a constraint to it. And that way, if we need to later on, the group has the constraint but not the eye lens. And so everything can move independently. So to create a group, I'm just basically going to hold down Command G, and that's for the apple. You can also go to create and then empty group, and that should create a group as well. So I'm going to name this group eyeball group. And that group is just going to store the eyeball and the eye lens. And now, of course, if I move this anywhere, the group, scale it up, anything like that, it should correspond and control the geometry that's inside. So the next step in this is now to take our eye control, and then I'm going to command left click on the eyeball group, and then now I'm going to go to create a constraint. And that constraint is going to be the aim constraint. Now I'm going to go to aim and then the option box. And right now, by default, if you go to reset settings, I always do this just to make sure I didn't accidentally put in something I didn't want to. I'm going to click on maintain offset. And what that means is that this position is going to be facing this control and maintain and store where that location is. And then I'm going to click apply. And now when I do that, I will follow. Now let me show you what happens and the reason why we have to make sure that everything is zeroed out. So let's just say that my eyeball group was to be positioned here, 90 degrees, okay? And then let's just say this was positioned this way. Let's see here. I'm going to rotate the eye this way, so that's negative 90 degrees. So it appears that everything's lined up as it should be, right? So if I was to click on this group and then go and click on my eyeball, if I was to click on the control, and then command click on the eyeball group, and I want to go to constraint and then the aim constraints and turn that back on. If I didn't turn on maintain offset and then I click apply, notice what happens. The eyeball just flipped around. Again, kind of like we did before with the scaling. So this is why it's very important. You want everything to be set or zeroed out. Zero out that eyeball, zero that. So I'm going to click on the control, click on the group, maintain offset, click apply, click close. And now the eyeball will follow. It will also follow direction out here, up here, and then of course we can dilate the eyeball at the same time. So next up, I'm going to create a lattice. And that lattice is now going to give us the cartoony effect that we want. So in order to create a lattice, I'm going to go to create deformers and go to lattice. I'm going to go to the option box. Now this gives you many different options and you'll see what it does in the end. But for now I'm just going to have divisions be 3, 3, 3 as well as local divisions and click apply. And then it creates this bounding box. And if I increase or decrease these, like I just select these and change up to 5, you'll notice that it creates many more points for influence. But to keep things simple, I'm just going to keep it at 3 because otherwise you'll be working with a lot of, there'd be a lot more calculations than needed for this particular situation. To show you what a lattice does, if we right click and go to Lattice Points, if I take any of these points and now I move them around, you'll notice that the eye shape changes dramatically. Okay. Same thing down here. And then I can even do stuff in the middle. It creates very unique shapes. And the cool thing is that if I was to smooth out using subdivision, it creates some nice rounding. That's why we use subdivision. So I'm just going to undo all that. The other thing is that if I shrink this, you get this really weird egg-like shape. Now the thing that I want to point out is that because these are points on a lattice, you can't really key them and animate them. You could change the divisions, but it's not going to allow me to control where this is in space. So I have to use something called clusters. So I'm going to select these lattice points, okay, and then I'm going to go to create deformers and cluster, and then option box. You have options for relative and so many more opportunities, but not very many. And I'm just going to simply click create. I'm going to do the same thing for the middle layer, so I'm just going to right click, go to lattice point, and then create clusters. Same thing down here. So now I have three little clusters, and you can see cluster handle 1, 2, and 3 have been created. Now, because this is essentially controlling a group of the lattice, you can now actually key any of these one positions, or all positions, of course. It's basically as if it was an object. And by selecting any of these handles, I can now manipulate those rows and get some really funky shapes. In fact, a pretty cool thing is that if I was to move this up, and I'll say, for the heck of it, I'm just going to select cluster 3 and then scale this down, and then scale this up a bit, get this really wonky, weird shape. Watch what happens with the eye. The pupil deforms beautifully inside. I used to think that lattice was just a way of distorting geometry for, modeling, but once I learned that this was available in rigging, I just became so excited because of what this means for our cartoony type world that we live in animation. So that's pretty much it for why you want to do something like this. And as I said, the blend shapes even work here too. And if I was to render this out, you see that everything is deforming quite nicely. See what it looks like off to the side. Yeah, pretty cool. So I just reset my scene to prior to all the manipulation. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new control so that we can then create 3 more controls and show you basically you can manipulate just the control instead of trying to select these clusters, because these are easier for an animator to grab than anything else. So I'm going to go to create. I'm going to create another circle, and then for now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide the geometry and then hide my lattice. And then I am going to duplicate this 3 times. So I'm going to hold down V and then snap to the cluster. I'm going to take this one and do the exact same thing. And even though this is pretty close to the origin, I'm just going to make sure, as you can see, it's not perfect, but it's pretty close. So then what I'll do is I'll just rename this, say top cluster control, and then I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to do middle cluster control, or mid, and then lastly bottom cluster control. Okay. And so in this case we can do the same thing. We can enable override. You may want to pick different colors. For now I'm just going to do yellow. Yellow is my favorite color today, I guess. Override. And so the other thing is that because the eye kind of perfectly fits around this control, what I might do first is I might size them differently, just to kind of give a sense of relativity. So maybe I'll make this half the size for the top, half the size for the bottom. Maybe I'll make this control, the mid one, just a little bit larger, so that I can easily select that and see it. So I'm going to then freeze transformations, because remember we scaled everything. So I'm going to go modify freeze transformations. I'm going to select this and do the same by holding or hitting G, left click, do the same here. And now I'll have my three controls for the eye. And then so after this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on my top cluster, and then, or actually first what I'll do is I'll group. Remember what I talked about grouping? So grouping will allow me to put the cluster inside. So I'm just going to hide the eyeball first. I'm going to hold down D and then press V, and that allows me to move the pivot of the group, and of course I'm just going to snap it to the cluster, and then I'll do the same thing for the middle. I'll group that, hold down D and V and snap to the cluster, and then group, and then hold down D and V, and then same for that. What that allows me to do is make sure that the cluster is relative to this, because if I scale my object, like let's say if I scale this, it will scale originally where the group puts its pivot, which is essentially at the origin. So we're going to make sure that pivot for the group is right on the cluster exactly where we want it. And there, again, for grouping, what this allows me to do is that when I do a constraint, the constraint will take over any of the attributes I set, and that will still allow the cluster to be moved or positioned at free will. And so it just gives a little bit more flexibility in your rig design depending on however you want to do it. So just to keep everything pretty straightforward, oops, what I want to do is I'm going to take this name, I'm going to copy it to my group, and I'm going to call this top cluster group. Enter. I'm going to do the same thing for group 2, which is the middle cluster. And this is me being very clean, or trying to, an attempt at being clean and keeping things pretty straightforward. I'd also name my clusters, but I'm just going to leave it as is. And so now, quite simply, all you're doing now is taking a top cluster, and then you're going to left click on that, and then click on your group. And then we're going to do two things. We're going to parent. And what parenting do when we maintain offset is allow us to have control of translate and rotate. So we'll keep maintain offset and then click apply. And notice everything gets locked down. So now the group is going to be completely controlled for the translate and rotate with this control. And then we're just going to go right down to bottom and do the exact same thing. Apply, and then we'll do the same thing with mid. And notice that parenting, even in our typical parenting, you'll have control of basically everything that child has attributes editable on for translate, rotate, and scale. But we, with constraints, also have to do that for scale as well. So I'm going to click close, and I'm going to just apply the same concept of constraints, but with scale as well. So go to constraint, I'm going to go to scale, maintain offset is on, click apply. Same thing, bottom control, click apply, and mid apply. Okay. So now that is all done, what I'll do is basically I don't need to see these clusters anymore, so I'm going to hide them. Okay. And so when I turn on my eye, I can lock this down. And now, quite simply, I can move my controls anywhere I want it to create the deformation I want. And then, of course, play with this control over here. Move it up and down. You can see I'm getting that beautiful cartoony eye distortion. And the other cool thing is that once you're done playing around, you can select those controls and this control, and then just zero everything up. Oh, and I think I forgot to show you this and this. We can make it totally marshmallow. Perfect.